Addiction didn't start with you, but recovery can. Welcome back to Healing Both Sides. I'm Christina Fox. We're continuing our Cycle Breaker series, where we're looking honestly at the patterns that can travel through families and generations and what it takes for us to finally say, "This stops with me." Some of these conversations will speak more directly to addiction and recovery. Some will speak more to the people who love someone struggling with addiction, and many will speak to both. But I want to make something clear as we move through this series. Cycle breaking isn't just about addiction. These conversations can apply to anyone's life. Maybe addiction isn't part of your story at all. Maybe your cycle is unhealthy relationships, poor boundaries, or never being taught boundaries in the first place, childhood trauma, abandonment, abuse, neglect, people-pleasing, anger, silence, constantly rescuing other people, avoiding difficult conversations, or simply repeating behaviors you watched growing up because nobody ever showed you another way. We all have patterns. Some were handed down to us. Some we learned by watching the people around us. Some developed because we were trying to survive what was happening in our lives. And some of them we've repeated for so long that we don't even recognize them as patterns anymore. That's why breaking cycles isn't about finding someone to blame. It's about being willing to look honestly at what we inherited, what we learned, what we've experienced, and even the patterns we've created ourselves, and deciding what we no longer want to carry forward. So wherever you're coming from, I want you to listen for your cycle. Because you don't have to have addiction in your story to recognize that something in your life needs to change. Some of these conversations will be uncomfortable, and that's okay. We're going to talk about the things people and families sometimes don't talk about. We're going to have compassion for where these patterns came from while still holding ourselves accountable for what we do with them now. Because we may not have started the cycle, but we can decide what happens next. Now that we've talked about what it means to become a cycle breaker, I want to start with one of the biggest cycles of all, generational addiction. And I'm going to say something today that might make some uncomfortable. Sometimes when addiction shows up in our child, our spouse, our sibling, or even in ourselves, we look at the person currently struggling and ask, "What happened to you?" But maybe we need to widen the lens, because sometimes the better question is, what happened before you? That doesn't mean mom caused it. It doesn't mean dad caused it. It doesn't mean grandma caused it. And it certainly doesn't mean someone struggling with addiction has no responsibility for what they do today. But addiction rarely ever appears out of nowhere. There is a trail. And if we're serious about breaking cycles, we have to be willing to follow it. Nobody else in our family has addiction. I've heard versions of this before. We don't have addiction in our family. But when you start asking questions, Grandpa drank every night. Grandma couldn't function without her medication. And Uncle was always drunk at family gatherings. Somebody was known for partying way too hard. Another relative disappeared for days. Someone else had problems with pills. But nobody called any of it addiction. They were just a drinker, a partier, going through a rough time, taking their medicine, having a few beers after work. Or my personal favorite. That's different, is it? Having a drink doesn't automatically mean someone has an alcohol use disorder. Taking prescribed medication doesn't automatically mean someone is addicted. We don't need to label every person who ever drank alcohol or took medication. But we also shouldn't rewrite our family history because the substance was socially acceptable. And alcohol deserves its own conversation here. We need to talk about alcohol. Alcohol is legal. It's socially acceptable. It's advertised everywhere. We are taught to celebrate with it, relax with it, socialize with it. We are even encouraged to drink once we have reached the legal age. Some may drink responsibly their entire lives and never develop an addiction. But legal does not mean harmless, and it does not mean addiction isn't possible. Alcohol addiction is still addiction. And sometimes families recognize addiction immediately when the substance is methamphetamine, heroin, fentanyl, cocaine, or another illicit drug. But don't recognize the same loss of control when the substance comes in a bottle from the grocery store. We need to be able to see things for what they are. Alcohol can absolutely become an addiction and destroy lives. If someone needs alcohol to function, becomes out of their own control, can't reliably control how much they consume, continues drinking despite serious consequences, or repeatedly tries to stop and can't, there is a problem. And if we're tracing generational patterns, we can't conveniently leave alcohol out because previous generations didn't call it addiction. Addiction doesn't travel in a straight line. Here's another misconception I want to address. People sometimes think, I'm not addicted and their father isn't addicted. So where did this come from? But family patterns don't work that neatly. Maybe mom never struggled with addiction. Maybe dad didn't either. But what about their parents? Their grandparents? Their siblings? Their aunts and uncles? Family history doesn't stop with the two people who created you. And addiction vulnerability doesn't necessarily pass neatly from addicted father to addicted son or addicted mother to addicted daughter. It can appear differently across generations. And sometimes what gets passed down isn't only a biological vulnerability. Sometimes it's the environment, the coping mechanisms, the trauma, the beliefs, the silence, the way emotions were handled or weren't handled, the way children watched adults respond to stress. Maybe nobody ever said, when life hurts, use something. But that's what the child observed. Bad day, drink. Relationship problem, drink. Celebrating, drink. Grieving, drink. Can't sleep? Take something. Anxious? Take something. Don't want to feel? Find something that makes the feeling disappear. Children learn long before we realize they're learning. And that doesn't mean every child who witnesses those behaviors develops addiction. Plenty don't. But we can't talk seriously about generational addiction while pretending environment doesn't matter. Genetics are not a life sentence. There is evidence that genetics contribute significantly to a person's vulnerability to substance use disorders. But I want to be very clear about what that means. Risk is not destiny. Having addiction in your family doesn't mean you're destined to become addicted. And not having an obvious family history doesn't mean you're protected from it. There isn't one simple addiction gene that decides someone's future. Biology interacts with environment, trauma, mental health, exposure, stress, development, access to substances, learned behavior, and many other factors, which means we should stop using family history in two harmful ways. The first is, well, addiction runs in our family, so there was nothing they could do. No. Increased vulnerability doesn't remove personal responsibility or the possibility of recovery. And the second is, nobody in our immediate family has addiction, so they shouldn't have this problem. That's not how this works either. We have to stop looking for one person to blame. Everybody wants to know whose fault it is. This is where these conversations can get ugly. When somebody we love develops an addiction, everybody starts searching for the moment it went wrong. Was mom too strict? Was dad absent? Was there a divorce? Was it childhood trauma? Was it their friends? Was it the prescription after surgery? Was it the boyfriend? The girlfriend? The neighborhood? Was grandma an alcoholic? Was somebody enabling? Whose fault is this? And sometimes searching for blame becomes another way of avoiding the problem sitting directly in front of us. Understanding how addiction developed matters. Blame doesn't necessarily help us heal it. If there was trauma, acknowledge it. If somebody caused harm, accountability matters. If parents made mistakes, we should be able to admit them. If someone struggling with addiction has hurt people, they need to eventually face that too. But there is a huge difference between what contributed to this and who can we blame for this. One question can lead us toward healing. The other can keep an entire family fighting while addiction continues doing what addiction does. Parents, this part may be uncomfortable. If your child struggles with addiction, eventually you may ask yourself, what did I do wrong? I know that question. And there may actually be things we wish we'd done differently. That's parenting. There may be things we didn't recognize, times we were too hard, times we weren't hard enough, things happening in our children's lives that we didn't know about, our own unresolved issues that affected how we parented. Maybe addiction existed in our family and we never talked about it. We can acknowledge those things. We should acknowledge them when they're real. But taking responsibility for our mistakes is different from taking responsibility for another adult's entire life. You can say, I wish I had handled that differently, without saying, I caused your addiction. And the person in recovery needs room to talk about their childhood honestly without every conversation becoming a trial against their parents. Because sometimes they need to say, this hurt me. And parents need enough healing of our own to hear that without immediately responding. Well, I did the best I could. Maybe you did. And maybe it still hurt them. Both can be true. That is exactly the kind of uncomfortable truth we're going to talk about on Healing Both Sides. Acknowledging someone's pain doesn't automatically make someone else a villain. And recovery has its own uncomfortable truth. If you're struggling with addiction or you're in recovery, understanding your family history can be incredibly important. Maybe things happened to you that should never have happened. Maybe addiction was normalized. Maybe you experienced trauma. Maybe nobody taught you how to process emotions. Maybe you inherited vulnerabilities you never asked for. Maybe adults failed you. None of that should be minimized. But there comes a point in healing where understanding why you're hurting has to become more than an explanation. Because eventually the question changes from, why am I like this? To, what am I going to do about it? Your history can explain you. It cannot heal you. And it cannot become permanent permission to continue hurting yourself or everybody around you. That's a hard truth. I think we can love people enough to tell them the truth. You may not be responsible for what happened to you as a child, but as an adult, healing eventually becomes your responsibility. Nobody else can do it for you. Not your mother, not your father, not your partner, not your children, not treatment staff, not a counselor. People can walk beside you. They can give you tools. They can support you. But eventually you have to use them. Maybe the substance isn't the only thing being passed down. This is where cycle breaking gets really interesting. Because maybe addiction isn't the only pattern we need to examine. What if the real family inheritance looks like? We don't talk about our feelings. We don't ask for help. Men don't cry. What happens in this house stays in this house. Don't embarrass the family. Just get over it. We don't need counseling. You don't tell strangers our business. Look at what they have done. I'm not that bad. Think about what happens when generations of people live like that. Where does grief go? Where does trauma go? Where does anger go? Where does fear go? Where does childhood pain go? It doesn't magically disappear because nobody talks about it. People find ways to cope. Some healthy, some destructive. Some people work constantly. Some control everything around them. Some shut down emotionally. Some develop unhealthy relationships. Some gamble. Some overeat. Some drink. Some use drugs. Different behaviors. Sometimes the same underlying attempt. I don't want to feel what I'm feeling. And that's why breaking generational addiction sometimes requires more than removing a substance. We have to teach ourselves things our families may never have known how to teach us. How to identify emotions. How to tolerate discomfort. How to ask for help. How to communicate. How to apologize. How to forgive. How to set boundaries. How to deal with trauma. How to sit with pain without immediately trying to escape it. Because if we only remove the substance without addressing what the substance was doing for us, we may still be carrying the cycle. This isn't only about the person using drugs or alcohol. Maybe addiction has traveled through generations of your family, and with it came another generational pattern. Everybody protects the person struggling. We don't talk about it. We cover it up. We make excuses. We rescue. We pay the bills. We take care of the children. We call the employer. We lie about why they aren't there. We keep everybody from finding out. And maybe that's what our parents did. Maybe that's what their parents did. Maybe nobody ever called it enabling. They called it taking care of family. That's another elephant in the room. Some behaviors that we inherited as love may actually be keeping unhealthy cycles alive. That doesn't mean our parents were bad people. It doesn't mean we're bad people. It means maybe nobody taught us another way. And that's exactly why one of our upcoming conversations is going to be about boundaries. Because many of us weren't taught those either. We learned family comes first. You don't turn your back on family. You help no matter what. You keep giving chances. You forgive. You don't give up. Those values can be beautiful. until they require you to destroy yourself to prove you love somebody. That's when we need to examine what we've inherited too. Somebody has to be the first. Every family cycle continues until somebody does something differently. Think about that. For generations, maybe nobody talked about addiction. Then somebody does. Nobody went to treatment. Then somebody goes. Nobody talked about trauma. Then somebody starts counseling. Nobody admitted mistakes. Then somebody apologizes. Nobody had boundaries. Then somebody learns them. Nobody knew how to live sober. Then somebody figures it out. And maybe they stumble. Maybe they relapse. Maybe the family struggles with the changes. Maybe everybody doesn't understand. Maybe people even get angry when the cycle breaker stops playing the role they've always played, or the role that someone expected them to play. That's okay. Breaking a cycle isn't always going to feel peaceful while you're breaking it. You're changing something people have learned to consider normal. It can all start with you. Maybe addiction didn't start with you. Maybe you can trace it back 3 generations, 5 generations. Maybe you can't trace it at all. Maybe nobody knows where it started. At some point, that stops being the most important question. Because whether you inherited vulnerability, learned unhealthy coping, experienced trauma, grew up around addiction, or developed an addiction in circumstances completely different from everyone else in your family, we still get a choice about what happens next. We get to decide whether we're going to continue the same family patterns, whether we're going to keep hiding things, whether we're going to keep rescuing, whether we're going to refuse to talk about uncomfortable subjects, whether we're going to continue carrying guilt that doesn't belong to us, whether we're going to teach the next generation that love means losing yourself, or whether we're going to learn something different. This is why I believe cycle breaking requires both sides. Not because both sides are equally responsible for addiction, but because addiction affects systems, relationships, children, parents, partners, homes, and eventually generations. So if we're going to talk about breaking generational addiction, we need everybody willing to look at what they're carrying. Not with shame, not with blame, with honesty. What did I inherit? What did I learn? What happened to me? What have I done because of it? And then the most important question, what ends with me? Maybe you weren't the beginning of the addiction in your family. Maybe it wasn't the beginning of the trauma, the beginning of the silence, or the beginning of unhealthy coping. Maybe you didn't start the rescuing. Maybe you didn't start your family's loop of losing themselves trying to save someone they love. But somebody gets to become the beginning of something else. The first person who gets sober, who doesn't change one addiction for another. The first person who stays. The first person who gets help for the trauma. The first parent who learns boundaries. The first family that stops hiding addiction. The first person who says, we can love each other and still tell the truth. And if nobody before you showed you how to do that, then maybe you're going to have to learn it. That's hard. But imagine what it means for the people who come after you. They won't have to start where you started, because somebody before them finally did the work. You did. The addiction may not have started with you, but recovery can. And recovery doesn't only mean putting down drugs or alcohol. Sometimes recovery is an entire family learning a healthier way to live. Before we end today, I want to leave you with something to think about. What part of this cycle belongs to you to break? Not your child's part, not your parents' part, not your partner's part, yours, because we can spend years waiting for someone else to change before we allow ourselves to heal. But cycle breaking doesn't require everyone in the family to start at the same time. Sometimes it starts with one person who tells the truth, who gets help, who chooses recovery, who sets the boundary, who stops rescuing, who deals with the trauma, who says, I'm not carrying this forward anymore. And that person might be you. I thank you for spending this time with me. To connect, please visit ChristinaFoxAuthor.com. From there, you can explore my books, listen to the podcast, read the blog, subscribe to my newsletter, and connect with me across all of my social media platforms. Until next time, remember, healing doesn't require us to choose a side. It requires us to understand that both sides have healing to do.